American troops once laughed at the Viet Cong's crude weapons, bamboo spikes, homemade traps, tunnels carved by hand. But beneath the dense jungle, they stumbled upon something far beyond their imagination. Hidden under their boots lay an underground world, a labyrinth of passageways stretching for miles, connecting command centers, hospitals, sleeping quarters, and storage rooms. It wasn't chaos. It was engineering brilliance, executed with nothing but determination and dirt. American engineers, trained with the most advanced technology of the 20th century, were stunned by the precision, the ventilation systems, and the sheer scale of it all. Down there, in the darkness, the Viet Cong lived, fought, and disappeared like ghosts. Every corner could be a trap, every silence a threat. For U.S. soldiers, it was more than just a battlefield. It was a nightmare beneath the earth. To understand how such a hidden world came to exist, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War.
By the early 1960s, the United States had become deeply entangled in a conflict that few Americans truly understood. Vietnam was not just another battlefield, it was a living maze of jungles, swamps, and rice paddies that swallowed up entire armies. The U.S. believed superior firepower and modern engineering could dominate the terrain. After all, they had ruled the skies with bombers, covered the land with tanks, and mapped every inch with helicopters. Yet the enemy they faced, the Viet Cong, refused to fight the kind of war America had prepared for. The Viet Cong were not a conventional army. They had no front lines, no fixed bases, and no interest in fighting head-on against an enemy with overwhelming firepower. Instead, they relied on stealth, deception, and patience. They fought on their own soil, in their own villages, and they used the jungle as their greatest ally. When the bombs fell, they vanished into the ground. When patrols searched for them, they melted into the earth. The idea of fighting underground wasn't new, but in Vietnam it became an art form. As early as the French colonial era, Vietnamese fighters had begun carving out small shelters and escape tunnels to hide from bombardments and ambush enemy troops. By the time American forces arrived, those primitive shelters had evolved into an elaborate network of subterranean bases stretching through the provinces of Cu Chi, Ben Cat, and Tây Ninh. Some systems reached as deep as 10 meters below the surface and extended for over 200 kilometers. Each layer of soil was studied carefully. Clay, sand, and laterite were mixed to strengthen the walls. Narrow passages were dug in zigzags to absorb shockwaves from bombs. Trapdoors were camouflaged so perfectly that even trained eyes could not detect them. Ventilation shafts were disguised as termite mounds, allowing fresh air to circulate without revealing the tunnel's location. The ingenuity was staggering. It was not just survival, it was defiance turned into engineering. For the Viet Cong, the tunnels were more than shelters. They were entire worlds hidden beneath the jungle. Inside, soldiers cooked meals with smokeless stoves, treated the wounded in makeshift hospitals, and held political meetings by candlelight. Some tunnels had meeting rooms, armories, kitchens, even water wells. They lived, fought, and died underground, believing that the earth itself protected them. To American strategists, this defied all logic. How could peasants, with hand tools and no machines, build something so sophisticated that it could withstand bombings, floods, and poison gas? U.S. engineers initially dismissed the reports as exaggerations. They assumed the tunnels were small hiding holes used temporarily by guerrillas. But soon patrols began disappearing. Entire squads went missing in areas the maps said were clear. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps below them, whispers echoing through the soil. The enemy wasn't just in the jungle, they were beneath it. As U.S. operations expanded, the need to understand this hidden world grew urgent. Engineers and intelligence officers began to realize they were facing something unique in modern warfare: an underground battlefield built by hand, maintained in silence, and defended with ferocious creativity. It was a new dimension of war, one that no American manual had ever prepared them for. The Vietnam War had introduced the United States to many surprises: brutal heat, elusive enemies, and a landscape that seemed alive. But none shocked them so deeply as the tunnels. They symbolized the very thing the U.S. military could not defeat: the patience, resilience, and relentless ingenuity of a people fighting on their own land.
When American forces began their ground campaigns in South Vietnam, they brought with them a belief that technology could solve anything. Helicopters could bring troops anywhere. Bulldozers could clear jungles in hours. Engineers could pave airstrips and build bases in record time. But none of that prepared them for what they were about to find beneath the earth. At first, reports of underground bunkers came in from patrols operating northwest of Saigon. Units near Cu Chi and Ben Cot claimed to have discovered small holes in the ground, so narrow that only one man could squeeze through. They thought they were animal burrows or hiding spots, but when soldiers dropped smoke grenades into the openings, the ground breathed. Smoke leaked out hundreds of meters away. Something vast was down there. When the first engineers were called in to investigate, they expected primitive dugouts. What they uncovered was far beyond that. The entrances were hidden beneath leaves, under floors of huts, even inside termite mounds. Each was covered by a trapdoor made from thick wood and coated in clay to mask its scent from dogs and the sound of footsteps above. Crawling inside was like entering another world, a suffocating maze of darkness, mud, and silence. The air was heavy and damp. Every breath tasted of earth. The tunnels twisted and turned in disorienting patterns, designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with them. The deeper the engineers explored, the more they realized the sophistication of what the Viet Cong had built. There were multiple levels connected by vertical shafts, each with its own purpose. The first level, close to the surface, was used for fighting positions and quick escapes. The second housed living quarters, kitchens, and armories. The third level went deeper still: meeting rooms, hospitals, even printing presses for propaganda leaflets. Some tunnels reached depths of 10 meters and stretched for miles, forming networks that linked villages, bases, and entire districts together. Ventilation was a masterpiece of improvisation. Because the Americans often dropped tear gas and smoke bombs into the tunnels, the Viet Cong designed airflow systems that curved and split underground. Shafts were camouflaged as termite mounds, tree roots, or wells, each angled to prevent gas from reaching lower levels. The air down there was stale but breathable. Incredibly, they even managed to control temperature, using the natural coolness of the earth to counter Vietnam's suffocating heat. Engineers studying the soil later found that the clay-like red earth of Cu Chi hardened after being dug, turning the walls into a natural cement. The tunnels didn't collapse easily; they were built to last. The kitchens, called Hoang Kam stoves, were an engineering marvel in themselves. Smoke was filtered through layers of soil and bamboo, so that by the time it reached the surface, it drifted out invisibly through hidden vents. American aerial reconnaissance, thermal imaging, and patrols could not detect them. Down below, soldiers could cook rice, boil water, and eat in silence while bombers roared overhead. For communication, runners used coded knocks or whispered messages. Maps of the tunnels were memorized rather than drawn to prevent capture. In some regions, the tunnels connected directly to rivers, allowing supplies to move unseen. Traps were placed at every turn, bamboo spikes, tripwires, and false floors that led straight into pits. The tunnels weren't just defensive structures, they were weapons themselves. They consumed time, manpower, and morale. When the U.S. realized the scale of what they faced, the Army created special units to explore and clear them. They became known as tunnel rats. These were small, agile soldiers armed with pistols, flashlights, and knives sent underground to hunt an invisible enemy. It was some of the most terrifying combat imaginable. Inside, it was pitch black. The tunnels were barely 2 feet wide. The air was hot and still. Every sound, the drip of water, the hiss of a match, the heartbeat in your own ears, could betray your position. Many tunnel rats spoke of crawling forward inch by inch, knowing a booby trap or a hidden enemy could be waiting in the dark. American engineers tried every method to defeat the tunnels. They pumped in water, gas, smoke, and explosives. They brought in bulldozers and even proposed flooding entire regions. But the tunnels always came back. Whenever one section was destroyed, another was dug deeper, narrower, or rerouted. The Viet Cong adapted faster than the Americans could react. For every new countermeasure, there was a new design. Some entrances were relocated under ponds. Others had secret exits miles away. The U.S. also experimented with chemical agents, attempting to collapse tunnels or suffocate those inside. But the complex design, with tight turns and airtight compartments, often prevented the gas from reaching its target. Many American soldiers who ventured underground found themselves choking on their own fumes, as if the tunnels were alive, bending, shifting, and protecting those who built them. For the American engineers, it was a humbling experience. They were trained in modern warfare, armed with blueprints, sensors, and explosives, yet faced an opponent using shovels, baskets, and instinct. The tunnels defied every principle of engineering they had been taught. There were no straight lines, no uniform dimensions, no visible logic, and yet everything served a purpose. The more they studied them, the more respect they developed for their builders. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers above ground never felt safe, knowing the enemy could emerge behind them. Bases were attacked from below. Entire squads vanished without warning. Even after clearing an area, Americans found new tunnel entrances days later, proof that the network was alive and constantly evolving. The jungle, it seemed, was not the only thing fighting back. The earth itself had become the Viet Cong's ally. By 1967, the U.S. command understood that the tunnels could not be completely destroyed. They were too extensive, too hidden, too resilient. Instead, operations like Cedar Falls and Crimp focused on isolating tunnel regions and denying their use. But the damage had been done. The tunnels had allowed the Viet Cong to move men and supplies freely, launch surprise attacks, and vanish again before the Americans could respond. It was a perfect system of survival and resistance, one that turned the very soil into a fortress. In military history, few engineering feats have matched the creativity and endurance of the Viet Cong tunnels. They were built by hand, often under bombardment, with no machines and no blueprints, just sheer determination. To American engineers, it was as if they were studying a mirror image of their own craft, the same principles of ventilation, structure, and design, but born from necessity, not theory. In the end, what they found beneath Vietnam's jungles wasn't just a network of tunnels. It was a symbol of how human ingenuity can thrive even in the harshest conditions, and how the smallest tools can outwit the mightiest machines. When the United States finally realized that the Viet Cong's underground world was not a myth, but an empire beneath their feet,
They decided to go down and face it. But no amount of training could prepare a man for what waited below the soil of Vietnam. By 1966, entire American battalions were operating in regions like Cu Chi and Ben Cat, where every patch of ground seemed to breathe with hidden life. The U.S. command called for volunteers, men willing to crawl into holes barely wide enough for a human body, armed with only a pistol, a flashlight, and their nerve. They became known as tunnel rats. These soldiers weren't chosen for strength or rank, but for size and courage. Smaller men, often under 5'7", were preferred. They were told nothing could simulate this experience. They would have to discover the nightmare themselves. A typical tunnel rat would remove his helmet, sling his M1911 pistol, and descend into the darkness. The air hit him first, thick, hot, and stale. The smell of earth mixed with sweat, oil, and sometimes the faint odor of death. The walls pressed against his shoulders as he crawled forward on his elbows and knees. His flashlight beam cut through clouds of dust, revealing only a few feet ahead. Behind him, the world of light disappeared, replaced by the slow rhythm of breathing and the creak of his own gear. Every sound became a potential threat. A drip of water could mask a footstep. A rustle might be a rat, or something far worse. The Viet Cong defenders knew their tunnels intimately. They laid traps at every corner, tripwires connected to grenades, bamboo spikes smeared with poison, or hinged floors that collapsed into pit traps. They listened through the soil for vibrations and could tell when an intruder was near. Sometimes they waited silently, inches away from a crawling American, letting him pass before striking from behind. In those tunnels, combat was fought at arm's length, face to face, often in total darkness. A pistol fired there could rupture eardrums. A single misstep could mean death. Engineers followed behind the tunnel rats, mapping each section by hand and marking danger zones. They tried to install lights and communication lines, but the narrowness made it almost impossible. The deeper they went, the more they realized the scale of the challenge. Some tunnels were too tight for even the smallest soldier. Others branched suddenly into chambers filled with supplies, weapons, or sleeping mats, still warm from use. Sometimes they found cooking pots, letters, or children's toys. It was a haunting reminder that these were not mere bunkers. They were homes, lived in for years beneath the battlefield. When the first major tunnel complexes were uncovered near Cu Chi, American commanders were shocked. They expected a few shelters, not an entire city underground. As they pushed deeper, they encountered resistance. Viet Cong fighters would pop out of hidden doors, fire a burst, and vanish again. Entire units vanished into the earth after ambushes. Above ground, bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives, shaking the jungle. Below ground, the tunnels flexed and survived. Shockwaves dissipated through curved passageways just as they had been designed to. The earth absorbed the violence. One of the most infamous battles beneath the ground took place during Operation Crimp in January 1966. American and Australian troops launched a massive sweep through the Cu Chi region. They uncovered hundreds of tunnel entrances, many booby-trapped or sealed with heavy doors. Tunnel rats from the 1st Infantry Division went down one after another. Some never came back, but those who did told stories that sounded like nightmares. Corridors narrowing to choke points, sudden dead ends, whispers in the dark. One soldier recalled crawling for what felt like hours, only to find himself circling back to where he started. The tunnels seemed alive, as if deliberately mocking them. In one section, a tunnel rat named Sergeant Tom Mangold crawled into a chamber filled with eerie silence. His flashlight flickered over a wooden chest. When he opened it, he found medical supplies, maps, and stacks of propaganda leaflets still fresh. Moments later, he heard footsteps ahead, then silence again. He aimed his pistol, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from behind a corner. The bullet grazed his arm. He returned fire blindly. When the smoke cleared, the enemy was gone, leaving only a drop of blood on the dirt floor. That was the tunnel war. Brief, brutal, and always uncertain. The Americans tried to bring technology underground. They used dogs, gas detectors, and explosives, but each attempt had flaws. Dogs panicked in the dark. Gas drifted unevenly. Explosives collapsed sections unpredictably, sometimes trapping their own men inside. There were moments of eerie stillness when engineers could hear faint coughing beneath their boots, evidence that tunnels were still occupied. They dropped smoke grenades into openings, only to see the smoke reappear hundreds of meters away through unseen vents. The jungle itself seemed to exhale. The Viet Cong exploited this confusion. They would use hidden exits to emerge behind American lines, launch surprise attacks, then vanish again underground. Bases thought to be secure were suddenly hit from below. The enemy was not just invisible, they were omnipresent. Engineers began to suffer from paranoia, constantly scanning the ground for holes or depressions. Some soldiers refused to sleep in certain areas, convinced they could hear digging under the earth. For them, the war had gained a new dimension, one of terror and claustrophobia. The tunnel rats, however, became legends. They fought a war no one else dared to enter. Many described how time lost meaning underground. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat poured endlessly. The air barely moved. Sometimes they crawled past the bodies of comrades who had gone down before them. In rare cases, they captured Viet Cong soldiers hiding in side chambers. The prisoners were dazed, covered in mud, eyes reflecting candlelight. One American later said, "Down there, we weren't enemies. We were just men trying to not die in the dark." As the campaigns dragged on, U.S. forces grew increasingly desperate to neutralize the tunnels. They brought in flamethrowers, flooding equipment, and even napalm. Entire regions were bombed repeatedly to collapse entrances. But no matter how much destruction they unleashed, the tunnels endured. After every operation, the Viet Cong returned at night to repair the damage. The Americans began to call the Cu Chi region the Iron Triangle, a place that could not be conquered. By 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the tunnels played a decisive role. They allowed the Viet Cong to move unseen, assemble forces, and strike suddenly across South Vietnam. Attacks on Saigon and U.S. bases were coordinated from underground command centers. Even as American intelligence believed certain zones were secure, troops emerged from tunnels to launch assaults that shocked the world. The tunnels had turned from a defensive refuge into a strategic weapon. Inside those dark corridors, American engineers documented everything they could. They took measurements, photographs, and soil samples. What they found defied belief. Complex ventilation networks, hidden wells, even electric wiring in some areas powered by stolen generators. It was architecture born from war, shaped by necessity, and executed with astonishing precision. The Viet Cong had turned scarcity into strength, transforming primitive tools into instruments of survival. For the men who experienced it firsthand, the tunnels left a permanent mark. Many tunnel rats returned home haunted by the silence and darkness they had endured. They spoke of dreams where they were still crawling, still reaching for the next corner, still waiting for the next trap to spring. One soldier summarized it simply: "You never beat the tunnels, you just survived them." From an engineering standpoint, the U.S. Army finally acknowledged what many field officers already knew. The tunnels could not be destroyed without destroying the entire landscape itself. The earth of Vietnam was not just ground, it was armor. Every foot of soil was a shield, every tunnel a blow against an invading force. And for American engineers, what began as a challenge to be solved became a humbling lesson in the limits of modern warfare. The climax of the tunnel war was not a single battle, but a realization. No bomb, no machine, no chemical could defeat an enemy that lived beneath the rules of conventional combat. The Viet Cong had built more than tunnels. They had built a new kind of warfare,
where patience, knowledge of terrain, and pure human will triumphed over industrial might. In that darkness, America faced not just the enemy's ingenuity, but its own misunderstanding of the war itself. The tunnels stood as silent proof that sometimes the greatest power lies not in technology, but in adaptation. Deep below the jungles of Vietnam, the ground itself had become a weapon, and the Americans, engineers, soldiers, and generals alike were forced to admit that the earth had outsmarted them.
When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent across the jungles of Vietnam, the tunnels remained, dark, silent, and defiant. The American engineers who once descended into those narrow corridors now stood above them, staring at the same earth that had swallowed entire divisions. They had come to Vietnam believing that modern warfare could solve anything, that enough bombs, machines, and data could bend the jungle to their will, but the tunnels had proved them wrong. Beneath the surface, an army had lived, fought, and survived without ever needing to match America's power. It was a brutal revelation. Technology alone could not conquer ingenuity. When U.S. troops withdrew, many of the tunnels were flooded or sealed, but vast sections still remained intact, untouched by time or explosives. Villagers later found forgotten chambers filled with relics, rusted rifles, propaganda leaflets, empty rice bowls, and sandals made from tires. The air inside was still heavy with the scent of soil and smoke. To walk through them years later was to feel the ghost of a war that refused to die. Historians who visited the sites were astonished. They mapped the Cu Chi system again and found more than 250 kilometers of interconnected tunnels, not random holes, but a city beneath the jungle. There were kitchens with smoke diffusion vents, hospitals with hidden operating tables, even theaters where fighters once sang to keep their spirits alive. For American engineers, the experience left a deep scar. Reports written after 1975 described the Viet Cong tunnel systems as one of the most sophisticated examples of guerrilla engineering in modern warfare. The simplicity of the tools, shovels, baskets, and bare hands only deepened their admiration. What they had tried to destroy with fire and steel had survived through patience, precision, and the understanding of nature itself. Some engineers who served in Vietnam later lectured at military academies, using the tunnels as case studies in asymmetric warfare. Their conclusion was simple but haunting. The future of war would not be decided by who had the biggest weapons, but by who best understood the terrain, the people, and the psychology of survival. Even decades later, the tunnels continued to reveal their secrets. Archaeologists uncovered sections that went deeper than anyone expected, with false floors and hidden air vents perfectly aligned to natural wind flow. Every inch of design spoke of adaptation, of using the land as both shield and sword. The U.S. military, humbled by this discovery, incorporated lessons from Vietnam into later conflicts, emphasizing counterinsurgency and human intelligence over pure firepower. But those who had crawled inside knew the truth. No training manual could ever recreate the feeling of being trapped in the dark, heart pounding, listening for the breath of an unseen enemy. Today, parts of the Cu Chi tunnels are preserved as a historical site. Tourists crawl through widened sections, guided by soft lights and safety rails. They laugh, take photos, and emerge into daylight covered in dust but smiling. Yet for those who once went down there with a gun instead of a camera, the memories remain raw. The darkness, the heat, the silence. They remember it all. One veteran, when asked what he felt seeing the tunnels again, said quietly, "It's like shaking hands with the past, a past that never lets go." In the end, the Viet Cong tunnels were not just a tactical weapon. They were a symbol of resilience, of resourcefulness, and of the human will to endure against impossible odds. The Americans, for all their machines and might, left Vietnam with a lesson carved deep into their memory. Never underestimate the power of those who fight not for conquest, but for survival. The engineers had entered the war believing they could outthink the enemy. They left realizing that sometimes the greatest genius is born not in laboratories or war rooms, but in the dark, silent earth beneath our feet. In the end, the tunnels outlasted the bombs, the tanks, and even the war itself. They were built not with machines, but with human endurance, dug by hands that refused to surrender. To the Americans, they were an engineering mystery. To the Vietnamese, they were a lifeline carved from earth and desperation. Beneath every footstep of the U.S. Army, an invisible world had existed, one that no satellite, no blueprint, and no amount of firepower could truly destroy. When the war was over, the tunnels remained, quiet reminders that victory is not always measured in battles won, but in the will to keep fighting when everything seems lost. American engineers had gone to Vietnam to test their technology. Instead, they found something far more powerful: the ingenuity of survival itself. The Vietnam War left scars on both sides, but the tunnels became its most haunting monument, a hidden city beneath a broken land. They told a story not of conquest, but of endurance. And for those who once crawled through that darkness, one truth would echo forever. In war, it's not the strongest who survive, but the ones who adapt beneath the surface.